They said the Elite Shooters Club wasn't a place for the average, and they were right. Tucked into the hills outside Boston, protected by gates and prestige, it was more fortress than firing range, a sanctuary built for champions, billionaires, and politicians who treated marksmanship as both blood sport and high society performance. Inside, the air didn't just hum with the scent of gun oil and brass, it pulsed with ego, wealth, and unshakable hierarchy. On this particular morning, it was unusually crowded. Word had spread that Blake Radcliffe was training again, and whenever Blake stepped onto the range, it became a spectacle. He didn't just shoot, he performed. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, designed to dazzle the eager eyes that followed his every action. Blake stood at center stage, wearing a tailored shooting vest stitched with his initials, a signature look he never varied. His rifle, a custom Remington with gold inlay, and a grip molded to the exact shape of his hand, rested against his shoulder like an extension of his body. He didn't look at the target before firing. He didn't need to. He smiled, almost lazily, and squeezed the trigger. The crack rang out. The bullet sliced through the air, and a moment later the target reeled back to reveal a flawless bullseye. Again, applause followed. Not polite claps, but genuine thunderous celebration. Some cheered, others whistled, and Blake turned to acknowledge them with a smirk that said, "Yes, I'm exactly as good as you think I am." This was his domain. He didn't earn it only with talent, though he had plenty. It was the legacy of being born into the Radcliffe name, into oil money and East Coast power circles, into private lessons, Olympic coaches, and unlimited access to the best equipment since he was 12. Every plaque on the club's wall bore his name. Every trophy in the glass cases was another stone in the monument of his ego. He had become a legend in a world where legends were manufactured, not born. He thrived under lights, interviews, and admiration. Behind him, his entourage lingered like loyal courtiers, PR reps, gear sponsors, and admirers hoping to be noticed. Blake never walked alone, not because he needed company, but because he needed witnesses. After all, what was the point of greatness if no one saw it? He adjusted his stance and lined up for another shot, but this time he paused. He sensed something different. A shift in the energy of the room, subtle but sharp. Someone unfamiliar had entered. His gaze drifted toward the entrance. That's when he saw her. She didn't belong, not by a long shot. And that's where the story really began. She stood just inside the doorway, holding a brown leather purse that had clearly seen better days. Her clothes were unremarkable, off-brand jeans, a plain blue cardigan, and walking shoes chosen more for comfort than style. A ponytail pulled her chestnut hair back from a face that was calm but unreadable. She looked around the opulent space with quiet hesitation, like someone who had stepped into the wrong building and wasn't entirely sure whether to retreat or move forward. Most people didn't notice her at all. A few who did gave her a quick glance and then dismissed her entirely. To them, she wasn't competition. She wasn't even interesting. The Elite Shooters Club was a place where appearance mattered as much as performance. Members arrived in sleek imported cars, wearing limited edition tactical gear and Oakley glasses that cost more than Emma's monthly rent. Everything about this place screamed exclusivity: velvet-trimmed gun racks, brass-plated fixtures, leather lounge seating, and an air of clinical perfection. Emma's presence disrupted that. She looked out of place, not just in her appearance, but in her energy. There was no swagger, no flex, no sense of entitlement. She walked with the kind of careful humility that came from knowing what it felt like to be overlooked. She approached the reception desk slowly, her eyes scanning the wall of certificates and sponsorship plaques behind it. The receptionist, a young woman with flawlessly styled blonde hair and perfectly manicured nails, was already mid-sentence with another member, but paused briefly to glance at Emma. That glance said everything. From her thrift store clothes to the envelope in her hand, Emma radiated the kind of anonymity this place was designed to keep out. The receptionist returned to her conversation, pretending Emma didn't exist. "Excuse me?" Emma said, her voice quiet but firm. The receptionist sighed as though already tired of this interaction before it had even begun. She turned back, eyes drifting from Emma's sensible shoes to her time-worn purse, up to her face with a practiced neutrality. "Members only," she said, enunciating each syllable like a closing door. Emma didn't flinch. She opened the envelope and held up a crisp slip of paper. "I have a day pass," she said. "It was a gift." That got a reaction. The receptionist's mouth tightened slightly as she reached for the pass, examining it as though she expected to find a forgery. Everything about her demeanor screamed resistance, not to Emma personally, but to what she represented. A breach in the carefully curated ecosystem, a reminder that skill didn't always come wrapped in privilege. "Open range practice ends at noon," the receptionist said at last, handing the pass back with the same care one might use to return a receipt for something they didn't want to buy. "Basic lanes only. Stay in your assigned area and try not to disturb the other members." Emma nodded politely, thanked her, and moved forward. She walked slowly, absorbing the details of the facility, the weight of stairs she pretended not to notice, the faint echo of shots in the distance, the distant murmur of laughter from the lounge. She passed glass cases filled with custom weapons, engraved rifles, carbon fiber handguns, matte black monstrosities designed more for aesthetics than function. The kind of pieces that belonged in magazines, not missions. From across the room, Blake watched. His expression was a mixture of amusement and calculation. He nudged one of his friends and gestured subtly in Emma's direction. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn on the way to a thrift store," he said, loud enough for others nearby to hear. The laughter came quickly. It always did when Blake spoke. His circle fed on that kind of casual cruelty, nothing overt, just little reminders of who belonged and who didn't. Emma didn't react. Her eyes were focused on the range ahead. She had the look of someone used to being underestimated, and even more used to ignoring it. She reached the far end of the practice lanes, the section reserved for basic drills and beginners. It was quieter here, away from the prestige-heavy elite lanes, where reputation was carved one shot at a time. She selected a booth at the edge, placed her purse gently on the shelf, and stood still for a moment, just breathing. Her hand reached inside the bag and withdrew a cloth bundle, wrapped in careful, almost reverent folds. She untied it slowly, unwrapping the shape inside like it was a ritual. A standard Glock 19, no modifications, no custom attachments, just a clean, reliable piece of machinery. She checked the chamber, loaded a magazine with fluid ease, and laid the gun down on the counter. Behind her, Blake and his entourage were beginning to drift closer. Curiosity peaked. The laughter had faded now, replaced by the kind of expectant silence usually reserved for car crashes or magic tricks. This wasn't supposed to be part of the day. A woman like Emma wasn't supposed to show up. Certainly not alone, not unarmed with fancy gear, not looking like she didn't even care what anyone thought. But something about her, something they couldn't name, held their attention. And in that moment, with a simple, unremarkable Glock and a borrowed day pass, Emma Miller stepped into their world without asking permission. And it was about to change forever. Blake leaned casually against the rail, separating the elite range from the beginner lanes, arms crossed, smile widening with each step closer to Emma's booth. He had no real interest in what she was doing. He'd already decided what kind of shooter she was before she'd even touched her gun. This was entertainment, a harmless sideshow, a distraction from the monotony of being the best in a room full of people who already knew it. His entourage flanked him, their expressions varying between amusement and anticipation, as if they were about to watch someone try karaoke for the first time and forget the lyrics. One of them pulled out a phone, already recording. "She's probably never even fired a gun before," one of them muttered, chuckling under his breath. Another chimed in, $10 says she can't even hit the paper. Never mind the target." Blake didn't laugh right away. He waited, letting the moment stretch. "Make it 10,000, he said coolly, loud enough to carry across the range. "I bet she couldn't hit a bullseye from 50 yards if her life depended on it." Emma, still adjusting her stance and breathing pattern, hadn't looked up once. Her movements were precise but unhurried. She didn't react to the comments, not to the snickering, the bets, or the way Blake's voice carried like he owned the air itself. She simply raised the Glock, exhaled slowly, and let her arms settle into a posture that betrayed muscle memory, not guesswork. Her stance was balanced, feet firmly planted, wrists locked, trigger finger steady but relaxed. Blake, undeterred by her silence, stepped closer, now just a few feet from her lane. His voice was mockingly polite, layered with enough sarcasm to stain every syllable. "Excuse me, Mom," he said with exaggerated politeness, "but are you sure you're in the right place? This isn't a quilting class, and we don't offer beginner lessons on Thursdays." His friends laughed again, but this time it was more restrained. Something in Emma's composure, her lack of response, made the moment feel off. Usually people reacted, got defensive, flustered, embarrassed. She didn't even blink. "I'm just here to practice," Emma said softly, her voice even, quiet but not unsure. That subtle confidence, the kind that doesn't announce itself but makes its presence known anyway, landed heavier than Blake expected. It threw him just slightly off rhythm. "Well," he said, recovering quickly, "practice is one thing, but this is a place for serious shooters, champions, professionals, not people just passing time." He leaned in slightly. "Tell you what, how about we make this interesting?" Emma finally looked at him, her hazel eyes locking onto his with a calm intensity. She didn't look intimidated. She didn't look angry. She looked like someone who had already heard a lifetime's worth of condescension and had grown immune to it. Blake didn't recognize the look. He wasn't used to people who didn't need to win arguments to prove something. "If you can hit the bullseye from 50 yards, he continued, "I'll pay you 10 grand, cash, but if you miss, you leave, today, and don't come back." He held out his hand, a grin spreading across his face, already certain she wouldn't accept, that she couldn't possibly believe she had a chance. Emma didn't shake it. She looked down at her left hand, thumb brushing the simple gold ring that still sat on her finger like a quiet vow. She twisted it once and then looked back at him. "I don't have that kind of money," she said. Blake smirked. "That's okay, you don't need to. If by some miracle you win, I pay. If not, you walk away. Deal?" A few people nearby were starting to pay attention now. One of the senior members had paused mid-conversation to glance in their direction. A young couple at a nearby booth had stopped firing to listen. Even Rebecca Johnson, the club manager, had taken a few cautious steps toward the commotion, her expression unreadable as she watched the scene unfold. Emma's gaze didn't waver. She didn't rush. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She just said, quietly, "All right." Blake's eyebrows went up. He hadn't expected her to agree. Not really. The others shifted, murmuring, a few pulling out phones, sensing that something worth filming was about to happen. No one noticed how Emma's shoulders subtly rolled back, how her breathing changed, becoming measured, rhythmic, how the Glock settled into her grip with the kind of familiarity that couldn't be bought. She didn't posture, she didn't preen, but everything about her posture said, "This is not my first time." Blake stepped back, arms crossed again, smugness returning. To him, this was already won. He'd issued a challenge. She'd accepted. Now she'd miss, and he'd get to gloat and reclaim the attention he felt slipping. He didn't know, none of them did, that they were watching a woman reconnect with the version of herself she had buried the day the flag was folded and handed to her. Emma raised the Glock, the moment held, and then she fired. The sound cracked through the range like a whip, sharper and more precise than anyone expected. A single shot, clean and confident. Then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from quiet, but from a collective breath being held all at once. Eyes followed the slow mechanical whir of the target retrieval system as it crept back toward Emma's booth, the paper target trembling slightly in the breeze of the indoor ventilation system. Blake stood completely still now, his smirk frozen in place, eyes narrowing as the target drew closer. He didn't speak, didn't mock. Not yet. Emma lowered the Glock gently, as if setting down something sacred. Her face betrayed nothing, no excitement, no smugness, not even satisfaction. Just that same quiet focus she'd walked in with, like she hadn't just placed herself under a spotlight she never asked for. Her breathing was steady, as though the shot had taken nothing out of her at all. Around her, conversations had stopped. Even the rhythmic cracks of nearby shooters had ceased, replaced by the ambient hum of fluorescent lights and the creak of chairs as people leaned in, craning for a better view. When the target finally arrived, it spoke for itself. One hole, dead center, a perfect bullseye, clean, unmistakable, undeniable. The murmur that followed wasn't the usual cheer reserved for club regulars hitting milestones. It was hushed, uncertain, tinged with disbelief. Blake took a step forward, eyes locked on the paper. He reached out, tore it from the clips, and studied it up close, as if it might reveal a secret the rest of them had missed. Maybe the target was defective. Maybe the bullet had torn through it in some freakish accident. Maybe it was rigged, but the hole was too clean, too precise, and the expression on Emma's face made it clear she hadn't come here to trick anyone. "That's beginner's luck," he said finally, his voice brittle around the edges. "Anyone can get lucky once." But the words didn't land with the confidence he usually wielded. He sounded more like someone trying to reassure himself than to dismiss what had just happened. Rebecca Johnson stepped forward now, her clipboard forgotten at her side, her expression one of cautious interest. "That was an exceptional shot," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the crowd. "Name, please?" Emma turned to her, her tone as calm as it had been since she walked through the door. "Emma Miller." Rebecca gave a slow nod, and there was something in her expression now. Respect, maybe, or recognition of something deeper than raw skill. "Miss Miller, we do have advanced range options available. You might be more comfortable there." Before Emma could respond, Blake cut in sharply. "Hold on." He was recovering now, trying to re-establish dominance. "One shot doesn't prove anything. You hit it once. Fine, but let's see if you can do it again, and again, under pressure, with real stakes." He stepped closer, his voice rising just enough to recapture the crowd's attention. "Let's raise the bar. How about this? 3 bullseyes, 75 yards. You hit them all, I'll pay $50,000 to whatever charity you name. But if you miss even once, you admit to everyone here that this was a fluke, and you walk away. No more practicing, no more games." The wager hung in the air like smoke. 50,000 wasn't a casual bet, even in a place like this. The challenge wasn't just about the money, it was about public validation, about putting Emma under the kind of pressure that cracked even trained professionals. Blake was banking on her folding under the weight of the crowd, the expectation, and the impossible odds. Emma didn't answer right away. She turned her eyes briefly to the back wall where flags hung, military units, sponsor banners, achievement plaques. She looked at them not like a tourist admiring trophies, but like someone remembering something personal, something earned, not given. Her hand moved again to her wedding band, and she twisted it once, the small motion subtle but telling. Then she looked back at Blake. "I'll take your challenge," she said quietly, "but on one condition." Blake raised an eyebrow, impatient. "Name it." "If I win," Emma said, "the money goes to the Veterans Support Foundation. No loopholes, no delays, full amount." The murmur grew louder. Even some of Blake's own crew shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the tone of the exchange had changed. This wasn't posturing anymore. Emma wasn't here for glory or pride or revenge. She was here for something else, something Blake didn't understand, and that made it dangerous. Blake hesitated, just for a second. Then he nodded, masking his uncertainty with a practiced grin. "Fine, it's your funeral." As Emma walked calmly to the 75-yard station, a path opened for her. The members, staff, and guests stepped aside, not because she asked them to, but because something in her movement commanded respect. She didn't puff out her chest. She didn't soak in the moment. She moved like someone who'd already made peace with the outcome, whatever it was. Like someone who had walked through harder things than this and come out the other side quieter but stronger. Behind her, Blake called out, just loud enough to ensure everyone heard. "Hope you brought more than beginner's luck this time." Emma didn't respond. She didn't have to. She placed the Glock down on the bench for a moment, letting her fingers rest gently against the cool metal. The murmurs of the growing crowd faded to a distant hum. Her focus turned inward, far away from the hardwood floors and brass railings of the elite shooters club. The smell of gunpowder in the air, the sting of scrutiny, the weight of being underestimated, none of it mattered in that instant. What mattered was the memory, the feel of another range, quieter, out in the open, where the world stretched wide in all directions and the only sounds were the wind, the rustle of trees, and his voice guiding her. 3 years ago, Emma had stood at Arlington, dressed in black, the sky a muted grey overhead, as if even nature couldn't bear the weight of the ceremony. The air had been cold, sharp, the kind that clings to your skin like regret. The honor guard had moved with solemn precision. 7 rifles, 3 volleys, a sound that tore through her like a final goodbye. They handed her the folded flag, tight corners, perfect symmetry, and she held it to her chest as if it might keep her from falling apart. Master Chief Nathan Miller, 15 years of service, SEAL Team 6, decorations too classified to name, and yet in the end he'd returned to her only as a memory, as folded fabric, as the echo of a life lived in silence and shadows. They'd told her it was a helicopter crash. That was all they could say. She'd sat in a small government office in Virginia Beach, a man in uniform across from her reading from a script he'd clearly memorized. Mechanical failure, immediate, no suffering. She'd nodded, thanked him, signed the forms, and left. But she knew better. Nathan had taught her to see past what people said, to pay attention to what wasn't said. There were details missing, entire pieces left blank. Classified mission, overseas location redacted, recovery details unavailable. And when she pressed, all she received were well-meaning apologies and security protocol disclaimers. The truth was buried, just like he was. They had met years earlier in Vermont, of all places. She'd been an accountant, still was, technically, living a quiet, structured life built around spreadsheets, tax codes, and weekend coffee rituals. Nathan had walked into her life like a storm disguised as a calm breeze. He was visiting a friend at the VA hospital. She'd spilled coffee on him in line at a cafe. The apology turned into conversation, the conversation into hours. He was older, not by much, but with eyes that looked like they'd seen 1,000 miles past what most people ever would. He asked her real questions, listened, and when he smiled, it felt like a secret he'd chosen to share only with her. They were married 6 months later in a tiny ceremony, just a few close friends, no photographers, no fanfare. Nathan wore his dress uniform. Emma wore a simple dress that swayed when she walked. There were no flowers, no speeches, just a quiet exchange of vows in the presence of those who understood the weight of promises. His team stood in the back, watchful, even in peace. They didn't talk much, but Emma never forgot the way they nodded to her, solemn and respectful, like she'd been inducted into a world she would never fully understand, but was now part of, nonetheless. Life with Nathan was filled with absences. He would disappear for weeks, months, no details, no warnings, and when he returned, it was with new scars, more silence, and deeper eyes. He never spoke about what he did, but in those moments between deployments, they found something rare. He would cook breakfast while she read in bed. They'd walk at night, hands barely touching, the quiet between them speaking louder than words. It was during one of those stretches of leave that Nathan took her shooting for the first time. "If I'm going to be gone a lot," he'd said, handing her a pair of earmuffs, "I need to know you'll be okay." At first, she'd laughed, thinking it was just one of those protective gestures husbands made. But the way he watched her, the way he adjusted her stance, it became clear this wasn't just about safety. It was about sharing something sacred. He taught her patiently, guiding her grip, helping her understand the balance between control and surrender. "It's not about being fast," he said one day after a long session. "It's about being still. You have to find the stillness inside. That's what makes the shot count." And she did. To both their surprise, she was a natural. Her vision was sharp, her nerves steady, her focus laser-precise. Nathan began bringing her out more often, not just for practice, but to train. They called it preparation. But Emma began to understand it was also connection, a way for him to give her a piece of his world, something personal in a life made of secrets. He taught her how to read wind by how leaves moved, how to adjust her aim using only breath and instinct, how to trust the shot before she even squeezed the trigger. Once, while packing up, one of Nathan's teammates, Michael Reeves, walked over, nodding toward her. "Boss says you're better than half the guys he trains," he said. "Says if you ever put on a uniform, we'd be out of a job." She had laughed, brushing it off. But Nathan just looked at her, serious. "You could be," he said. "You have the hands for it, and the heart." The last time they shot together was 2 days before his final mission. He'd been quieter than usual, more focused on watching her than on hitting his own marks. They packed up in silence. As they loaded the gear into the truck, he paused, hand resting on the tailgate. "Promise me something," he said, voice low, almost gravelly. "Promise me you'll keep practicing. Even if I'm not there, keep it sharp, keep it yours." Emma had nodded, not knowing why her chest hurt so much. She remembered kissing him goodbye at the door, watching his truck disappear down the road, telling herself he'd be back in a week, maybe 2. He never came back. After the funeral, she locked away his guns, couldn't touch them, couldn't even look at them. She moved to Boston, took a job at a firm where nobody knew her as Nathan's widow. She buried herself in numbers, spreadsheets, and safe routines. She turned down invitations, avoided conversations, and slowly, quietly, became invisible. Until 1 week ago. A package arrived at her door. Inside was a day pass to the Elite Shooters Club and a handwritten note from Michael Reeves. It was brief, just a few lines. 3 years is long enough to hide. Nathan would want you to keep your promise. Come back to the living. She had stared at the pass for hours before placing it on the counter. The note stayed in her purse for days, but every time she reached for her keys, it was there. A reminder, a dare, a thread back to the life she'd tried to lock away. And now, here she was, standing on a line, facing a man who thought she didn't belong, holding the same weapon she once used to sink her breath with the only man who ever saw her fully. She loaded the Glock, raised it again, let the noise of the room fade behind her. Her body remembered what her heart had carried all along. This wasn't about proving herself. It was about keeping a promise. Emma took a step forward and aligned herself behind the firing lane once more. This time, there was no setup, no dialogue, no room left for doubt or second-guessing. The terms were clear. 3 shots, 75 yards. A target most shooters in this club wouldn't even attempt without a high-powered rifle and a bench rest. She had a Glock 19, standard sights, no fancy attachments, no red dot, no stabilizer. Just her breath, her memory, and the stillness Nathan had taught her to find deep inside herself. The air had changed. Where there was once mockery, now there was anticipation. Members who had previously ignored her were leaning forward slightly, lips parted, waiting for the impossible. A few had stepped quietly into the lanes beside hers, pretending to adjust their own targets, but clearly watching her out of the corner of their eyes. Emma didn't acknowledge any of it. She focused on what mattered, her stance, her balance, the weight of the pistol in her hands. She took a breath, inhaled slowly, held it, released half, just like Nathan taught her. Her finger moved. The first shot echoed through the range, sharp and pure, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. The recoil was absorbed smoothly by her arms, her core already locked in position, already resetting. The target at the far end didn't move, but as the slow mechanical arm began its return, there was already a different kind of electricity in the room, one that comes not from surprise, but from the dawning realization that something significant is happening. People waited, no one spoke. The murmurs were gone now, replaced by something deeper. Stillness, the kind of reverence usually reserved for the edge of a cliff or the middle of a church service. The target reached her station, another bullseye. Not just close, center. A shot that could only be made by someone who had trained under pressure, under silence, under the watchful eyes of men who measured survival in fractions of an inch. There were no cheers, no applause, only the sound of Blake's jaw clenching quietly in the background. Emma didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She reset. She ejected the spent round, loaded again, and returned to her stance with a serenity that made even experienced shooters shift uncomfortably. She wasn't performing. She wasn't hesitating. She was remembering not just the skill, but the moments behind the skill. Nathan standing behind her, hand on her shoulder, correcting her posture, whispering reminders in her ear. Breathing, focus, calm, control. The second shot came quicker, but not rushed. It was deliberate, with the kind of confidence born not from ego, but from discipline. The report cracked again, and this time a low exhale moved through the crowd, a ripple of disbelief forming beneath the surface. The target rolled back. Another perfect hit, same center, same hole. Blake's expression didn't change, but his posture had. A subtle lean forward, hands now clasped, knuckles white. Emma took her time with the third shot. She twisted her ring again, not for luck, for grounding. In that moment, she wasn't thinking of Blake. She wasn't thinking of the money, or the crowd, or the fact that half the club's elite members were now watching her like she was something they couldn't explain. She was thinking of that last afternoon, before Nathan left. The way he'd watched her, not like a teacher assessing a student, but like a man memorizing the sight of someone he loved doing something she didn't yet realize she was extraordinary at. Whatever happens, he'd said that day, this part of me, it's yours, and you're better at it than you know. She squeezed the trigger. The third shot cracked louder than the first two, not because of the volume, but because of the weight it carried. When the target returned this time, the movement seemed slower, as if the room itself wanted to stretch the moment. As it approached, even those who had doubted her were silent. No one touched their phones. No one dared speak. And when the paper stopped moving, and the third bullseye came into view, clean, precise, unmistakable, a sound did come. But it wasn't applause. It was awe, a collective breath that no one realized they'd been holding, released all at once in quiet reverence. Emma stepped back from the line and placed the Glock on the counter. No flourish, no performance, just calm, practiced movement. She looked ahead, not at the crowd, not at Blake. Her expression remained unchanged, steady, unmoved. Blake walked over slowly, snatching the target sheets from the clips with more force than necessary. He examined them closely, flipping them over, holding them against the light, like there might be some trick hidden in the paper. "This isn't possible," he said finally, voice low and sharp. "No one walks in off the street and shoots like this." Rebecca was already moving toward Emma, holding a clipboard, but her usual polished professionalism had slipped. What replaced it was something much rarer, admiration. She didn't speak immediately. She simply nodded once, then twice, as if confirming to herself that what she'd just seen wasn't a trick of the light. "Miss Miller," she said after a moment, "that was remarkable." "Emma," she replied softly, "just Emma." "Emma," Rebecca repeated, a genuine smile beginning to form. "Perhaps you'd be interested in using our advanced range facilities. Clearly, you're not a beginner." Blake stepped forward again, trying to reclaim the air. "Wait a minute," he said. "This isn't over. 3 shots don't prove anything. Let's see if she can do it again, with real stakes, something official." The crowd stirred again, uneasy now. Blake's voice had an edge to it, no longer amused. The arrogance was still there, but underneath it, something else. A strain, a crack in the marble. "I'm talking about a real competition," he continued. 10 stations, varying distances, club-provided firearms, so we know no one's rigging anything. We go head-to-head. He turned to Emma, daring her. "You win, I pay 50 grand to your charity. You lose, you leave. Simple." Emma didn't answer right away. She looked at the targets, still fluttering slightly from the air current. 3 perfect bullseyes, not one wasted breath. She didn't need this challenge. But there was something about the way Blake issued it, the entitlement in his tone, the disbelief in his voice, the refusal to accept that someone outside his world might simply be better. "I'll do it," she said. "One condition." Blake's smile returned, prematurely. "If I win, the money goes to the Veteran Support Foundation," she said again. "And this time we make it official, public, transparent, no shortcuts." He hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. "Deal." Word spread like wildfire, first through the spectators, then across the lounge, then beyond the walls of the elite shooters club. By the end of the afternoon, it wasn't just the day pass holders and idle observers who were talking about Emma Miller. It was board members, senior marksmen, and the club's exclusive sponsors. The club's online message board lit up with threads speculating about her identity. Some called it beginner's luck. Others, the majority, weren't so sure. 3 consecutive bullseyes at 75 yards with a stock Glock wasn't just difficult, it bordered on absurd. It was the kind of result even seasoned competitors struggled to achieve consistently, and yet she had done it with the calmness of someone clocking into work. Back in the main hall, Blake's entourage had pulled him aside. The grins were gone, replaced with sidelong glances and low-voiced questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why hadn't anyone heard of her before? Blake brushed them off, jaw clenched, ego bruised in a way he hadn't felt in over a decade. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not here, not in his stronghold. He tried to laugh it off, called her a fluke again, said she probably just watched some YouTube tutorials and got lucky, but even as he said it, the words tasted hollow. His mind was already spinning in a different direction. By the time Emma was collecting her bag and preparing to leave, the club's manager, Rebecca Johnson, found her near the lockers. Rebecca had once competed herself, never on Blake's level, but well enough to know the difference between showmanship and substance. She studied Emma's face for a moment before speaking. "I'd like to walk you out, if you don't mind," she said, voice calm but curious. Emma nodded. They walked in silence past the rows of plaques and portraits on the hallway walls, men and women immortalized in polished wood and brass. Blake's name appeared more than anyone's, always centered, always in bold. When they reached the exit, Rebecca finally said, "I've managed this place for 9 years, seen world-class shooters from across the country, Olympians, soldiers, enthusiasts with too much money and nowhere else to burn it. But I've never seen what I saw today from someone who walked in with a day pass and no listed shooting background." Emma adjusted the strap on her purse, unbothered. "Who are you really?" Rebecca asked, but gently. There was no accusation in her tone, just curiosity. Emma gave a small, tired smile. "Just someone keeping a promise." Rebecca hesitated, as if sensing there was more, but knew better than to press. "You'll hear from us soon," she said, "about the formal match. Blake doesn't let things go, and when his ego's on the line, he'll go all in." Emma nodded once, then pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the evening air, leaving behind a room full of questions and a man who couldn't stop asking them. Blake, meanwhile, was already on the phone in a quiet corner of the club, pacing beside the fireplace as the flames danced. The number he dialed wasn't in his recent contacts. It was one he hadn't used in years, belonging to a private investigator who had helped him dig into a rival competitor's background before a high-stakes national tournament. "She gave her name as Emma Miller," Blake said into the phone. "Check everything. DMV records, employment history, prior residences, competitive affiliations, gun range memberships. I don't care how small. and find out if she's ever trained formally. She's hiding something." The voice on the other end replied with a simple confirmation. Discreet, efficient. Blake ended the call and stared into the fire, his reflection rippling in the glass panel. The more he thought about her stance, her breathing, her grip, the more it haunted him. It was too controlled, too refined to be anything casual, but it wasn't competition-style shooting either. It was something else, something colder, tighter. He'd seen it before, years ago, at a military demo where a visiting Special Forces sniper performed live fire drills for a group of sponsors. That same kind of stillness, that same deadly economy of motion, it gnawed at him. And the ring. She kept twisting that gold band on her finger, not out of habit, not like a nervous tick. It was deliberate, like it meant something, like it anchored her. He turned away from the fire and back toward the lounge, where the last of the afternoon's crowd was dispersing. No one spoke to him now, not even his closest friends. They had all seen it. Not just the shots, but the way he'd been caught off guard. The way Emma had done what she came to do without breaking a sweat, and without needing to tear anyone else down to do it. It wasn't just a shooting display, it was a quiet humiliation. And Blake Radcliffe didn't lose. Not like that, not ever. So he would prepare. He would reassert control. The challenge was already set. 10 stations, varying distances, club-provided equipment. The club would publicize it, spin it into a major event, a spectacle for members, press, and sponsors alike. And he would reclaim his throne in front of everyone who had started to doubt. He would expose Emma Miller as a one-day wonder, or crush her if she wasn't. By the next morning, the challenge had officially been announced. A flyer circulated through the club's email list, complete with dramatic wording. Head-to-head showdown, Radcliffe versus Miller. 10 stations, 10 firearms, 1 winner. The match would be held exactly 1 week later, open to club members and select guests. What was normally a place for quiet elitism was quickly transforming into the stage for something bigger, something personal. And Blake had every intention of making it a spectacle. He spent the morning with the board, requesting changes to the equipment list. An array of weapons designed not only to test skill, but to test range familiarity. A vintage revolver, a competition-grade 1911, an AR-style carbine, a bolt-action hunting rifle, a high-caliber pistol with a kick known to rattle even experienced hands. Each firearm chosen not just for diversity, but for its tendency to reward repetition, practice, and intimate knowledge. Blake knew them all. He had trained on them, competed with them, won with them. Emma, he was betting, had not. And at the end of the lineup, he added one more, the Macmillan TAC-338, a precision rifle with exceptional range, engineered for long-distance engagements and barely known outside of military and professional sniper circles. It was overkill for civilian use, but Blake had one, a custom build gifted by a defense contractor after his Olympic win, and he wielded it with frightening ease. Most shooters didn't even attempt it without days of calibration. He insisted it be the final station. The board, sensing the buzz the match would generate, approved all changes without much discussion. Meanwhile, Emma sat in her apartment in Boston, the printed flyer spread across her small kitchen table beside a mug of untouched coffee. The 10-station format didn't surprise her. Blake wanted to make it technical, to tilt the playing field in his favor without looking like he was afraid. The man couldn't stand the idea of losing on equal ground. She scanned the list of firearms and recognized a few from her sessions with Nathan. But others, especially the precision rifles, were unfamiliar. She didn't panic. She just noted each one down in a notebook, added a list of ranges that might allow access to similar models, and began to plan her week methodically, like a campaign. She hadn't fired anything longer than a Glock or an M4 in years, but the fundamentals weren't foreign to her. Nathan had taught her to adapt, to observe, to learn weapons the way a violinist learns strings, by feel, balance, and discipline. The TAC-338, though, that was a different beast. Emma had heard Nathan mention it once, late at night when he'd been half awake and talking more freely than usual. "The kind of tool you use when you need a ghost to do your talking," he had said. She remembered the phrase because of how tired he'd looked when he said it. She reached for her phone, opened a message thread she hadn't used in years, and stared at the name for a moment before typing. "Michael, need your help. You still in the area?" The reply came back just 10 minutes later. "Yeah, heard about the challenge. I've got access to what you need. When and where?" They agreed to meet the next morning at a private outdoor range an hour outside the city. She took the rest of the day off from work, something she hadn't done in years, and spent the evening studying. She watched tutorials, read manuals, memorized specifications. Not to learn the weapons, those were just tools, but to understand their personality, their rhythm, how they wanted to be held, balanced, and fired. Each one told its own story if you listened carefully enough. Back at the club, Blake was rehearsing his own narrative. He met with his publicist to craft statements, with sponsors to confirm logo placements, with the club's media team to prepare streaming access for select audiences. He wasn't just preparing for a competition, he was staging a comeback, a public reassertion of dominance. He planned every detail, even going so far as to order matching gear for himself and his team. He practiced his posture for photos, wrote down a list of sound bites he might use if interviewed, lines that sounded off the cuff but would be repeated in headlines by Monday. Still, in quiet moments, when the crowd faded and the lights dimmed in his mind, Blake kept seeing those 3 bullseyes. He kept seeing the way Emma hadn't flinched, hadn't crowed, hadn't tried to claim anything from the moment. That kind of control wasn't accidental, it wasn't luck, and it wasn't new. He made another call to his investigator that evening, voice sharp and impatient. "You've had 48 hours. What do we know?" "Still working through the background," the man replied, professional as ever. "Emma Miller, age 35, accountant, moved from Virginia Beach 3 years ago. No known competitive shooting history. Clean record. Keeps a low profile." Blake ground his teeth. "She didn't learn to shoot like that from a book. Keep digging. Start with her Virginia connections, friends, family, and that ring she keeps touching. Figure out who gave it to her." "I'll have something in a day or two." After the call, Blake stood in his penthouse overlooking the Charles River, the city lights flickering like false stars. He poured himself a drink but didn't sip it. He just stared into the glass, replaying the footage from earlier that day on his phone. He'd watched it a dozen times. Emma's form, her breathing, the moment she raised the Glock and fired without hesitation. There was something in her that unnerved him, not because she was better, but because she didn't need to be seen. She didn't want attention, she didn't want applause, and that, more than anything, was the thing Blake couldn't understand, because if she didn't want recognition, why was she still here? The morning air at the outdoor range was brisk, clean, and biting enough to pull Emma back into focus the moment she stepped out of her car. The trees beyond the berms swayed gently under a cloudy sky, and the faint scent of earth and gunpowder lingered in the wind. Michael Reeves was already there, waiting beside a beat-up SUV with faded military decals and a duffel bag at his feet. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, the kind of nod that said, "We're not wasting time." "Got you access to the whole place for the day," he said as she approached. "Owner's an old Marine, likes the quiet and doesn't ask questions. TAC 338's in the case. Brought a few other toys too. Figured you'd want options." Emma gave a small, appreciative nod and knelt beside the bag to unzip it. Inside was a carefully arranged arsenal, rifles, pistols, sights, and tools. Weapons that weren't just expensive but familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. These weren't collector's pieces. These were functional, maintained, and ready. Her hands moved automatically, checking chambers, weights, balances. She could still hear Nathan's voice in her mind as her fingers brushed the cold metal. "Always check it yourself, every time. No shortcuts, no assumptions." Michael stood a few paces back, arms crossed, watching her silently. He didn't offer commentary or advice. He knew better. She was here to reconnect with a version of herself that had been buried, not to be handheld through drills. But after a few minutes he did speak, his voice low, steady. He used to talk about you, not often, but when he did, it was always with this clarity. Said you saw straight through people, said you were the only one who could make him sit still. Emma smiled faintly, not lifting her eyes. He used to say the same about you, that you never talked unless it mattered. Michael gave a short chuckle. Sounds about right. The next few hours unfolded in complete silence. Emma started with familiar firearms, working through each station setup she had memorized from the challenge list. She moved deliberately, not wasting time, but not rushing either. Every shot was a question answered. Every recoil, a handshake with muscle memory. Her breathing synced with the rhythm of reloading. Repetition dulled hesitation, and hesitation had no place in what was coming. When she finally approached the TAC-338, her pace slowed. The rifle looked out of place in the dirt, too sleek, too engineered, like a predator in a room full of tools. She lay prone, adjusted the bipod, and scanned the distance. Michael walked over without a word and dropped a small notebook beside her. Found this in his gear, he said. Wind calculations, distance charts, notes from his long-range days. Might help. Emma opened the notebook carefully. Nathan's handwriting was sharp, almost surgical, not a single line wasted. She ran her fingers over the faded ink, feeling the weight of his presence in each scribble. He had written her name on a few pages, noting her progress. EM, 300 yards, 7 of 10. Good adjustment under stress. Better than expected. Might outshoot me one day. That last line stung, soft and sharp, all at once. She exhaled, sighted down the scope, and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked across the field, a deep, bone-shaking sound. She held position, waiting for the hit. It landed a few inches left of center. Not perfect, but close. Her lips pressed into a tight line. She adjusted, fired again, this time dead center. By noon she was landing bullseyes with consistency, slowly closing the gap between familiarity and control. The TAC-338 demanded absolute focus, punishing even the smallest mistakes. But she learned quickly. Nathan had once told her long-range shooting was meditation under pressure, and today, for the first time in years, Emma felt something close to peace in the precision. After the final shot, she sat up slowly and rubbed her hands together, flexing out the tension in her wrists. Michael handed her a bottle of water, and they sat together under the clouded sky, saying nothing for a while. Finally he spoke. You know he'd be proud, right? Emma didn't respond immediately. She stared out over the range, eyes unfocused. I'm not doing this to prove anything, she said eventually. Not to him, not to Blake. I'm doing it because I promised. Because if I don't know who I become. Michael nodded once. Then that's reason enough. Back in the city, Blake sat in a private lounge at the club, scrolling through documents on his laptop while sipping a drink that had long since gone warm. His investigator had finally called back earlier that morning, and what he'd learned had unsettled Blake more than he cared to admit. Emma Miller, accountant, 35, previously lived in Virginia Beach, no online presence, no criminal record, but she had been married. Spouse, Nathaniel R. Miller, KIA, 3 years prior, United States Navy, SEAL Team 6, rank Master Chief, specialty sniper operations. Blake had stared at the words for a long time. The Ghost. He'd heard the nickname before, whispered among the defense industry's inner circles. A shooter so good they said he could hit a target he couldn't even see. Urban legend. Boogeyman. Every community had one. But now Blake was looking at the paperwork, the medals, the service record, and most of all, the connection. Nathan Miller had trained his wife, privately, quietly, thoroughly. It explained everything, the form, the breathing, the refusal to grandstand. This wasn't a civilian hobbyist with a lucky streak. This was the product of years of exposure to someone who had lived and died by the trigger, and Blake felt it like a weight on his chest. He didn't want to admit it out loud, but he knew what it meant. He wasn't up against a random nobody. He was up against the widow of one of the deadliest men the US military had ever trained. And she wasn't here for fame. She was here to finish what he started. The sun was just beginning to set when Emma pulled into her apartment complex, the golden light filtering through the trees and casting long shadows across the pavement. She sat in the car for a moment, engine off, hands still on the wheel. Her muscles ached from the hours spent prone, her fingers sore from the weight of unfamiliar rifles, but her mind was sharp, focused, clearer than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't moving through the world in a haze of grief and routine. She was engaged, alive, drawn into something bigger than herself, but deeply personal. Inside her apartment, she placed Nathan's notebook on the table and opened it again, flipping slowly through the pages. There were calculations written in shorthand, corrections in the margins, bullet trajectories sketched with careful attention. On one page, a note stood out in darker ink, bolded and underlined. Only 3 things matter: breath, balance, belief. Everything else is noise. She read it again and again, letting it settle into her bones. She could almost hear his voice saying it, calm and sure, like he used to when they practiced, when he would place a hand gently between her shoulder blades and guide her into position. He always insisted that marksmanship wasn't about aggression. It was about control, clarity, and conviction. She stayed up late that night, cleaning the Glock, going over her notes, highlighting the firearms from the challenge list she still felt unsure about. She didn't have a military-grade training facility or endless hours to prepare like Blake probably did, but she had something else: discipline. Nathan had once told her that real shooters don't waste bullets or time. They learn fast, they adapt, they find the shot, even in chaos. As the clock crept past midnight, her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Rebecca Johnson. Blake has submitted additional changes to the challenge format. The board approved them tonight. 10 weapons, 10 stations. Final one now counts for 30% of the total score. Emma stared at the screen for a moment, then typed her response. Let me guess. Final station is the TAC-338? Rebecca replied within seconds. Exactly. You okay with that? Emma didn't hesitate. No changes needed on my end. Across the city, Blake received the news that his modifications had gone through. He stood on the top floor of a luxury fitness center, his reflection in the darkened windows nearly blending into the Boston skyline behind him. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Everything was falling into place. The competition would be televised internally, streamed to private club investors and elite members across the country. This wasn't just a match anymore. It was an exhibition, and the final station was his crown jewel. No one outside of Special Forces sharpshooters or long-range competition veterans had a prayer of mastering the TAC-338 in under a week. No one, unless they had been trained by someone who lived behind a scope. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't as secure as they appeared. He paced the length of the studio, silent except for the soft taps of his shoes on the polished floor. Jessica, his longtime girlfriend and a silent observer to most of his career, sat nearby, scrolling through her tablet. They're still talking about her, she said. Clips from the range are getting passed around. Quiet confidence, bullseyes under pressure, the whole thing starting to feel mythic. Blake didn't respond right away. She has no record, he said eventually. No tournaments, no online footprint, no sponsor history. You don't shoot like that without training. You don't train like that unless someone serious taught you. Jessica looked up from her screen. And now you know who did. He turned to face her. Nathan Miller, the ghost. She nodded. Does it change your plan? Blake walked to the bar and poured a glass of scotch. Number it changes the stakes. That's all. She studied him, then said, It's not just about beating her anymore, is it? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back in her apartment, Emma opened a small wooden box from the top shelf of her closet. Inside were the things she hadn't touched since the funeral: Nathan's medals, a sealed envelope with her name in his handwriting, and a folded photo of the two of them standing in front of a field range, smiling. He had his arm around her, his other hand pointing at the target board. She was laughing in the picture, genuinely, eyes squinting in the sunlight. She didn't recognize that woman anymore. But something about seeing her made Emma feel grounded. She carefully unfolded the envelope. It had only a single sheet inside, his writing again, steady and sure. "If you're reading this, it means the worst happened, and I'm sorry. I never wanted to leave you behind, but if I had to go, I wanted you to know this. You're stronger than you think. If there's a day when everything hurts and nothing feels real, find a range, pick up a weapon, find your breath again. You were always better than you believed. Trust it. Trust you." She read the words 3 times, then pressed the paper to her chest, eyes closed. The next morning, she drove 2 hours outside the city to a private facility Michael had mentioned. A place rarely visited, built on old farmland, where long-range targets were set into the hills. She brought the TAC 338 and Nathan's notebook. She stayed there until sunset. She missed more shots than she liked, but each miss taught her something. Each adjustment got her closer. Her breathing slowed, her instincts sharpened, her body remembered, and with each shot she felt the distance between grief and clarity shrinking. She wasn't just training to compete. She was reclaiming the silence that had swallowed her since Nathan's death. And with every passing day, Blake's challenge became less of a test, and more of a reckoning. The night before the competition arrived faster than Emma expected. The hours had blurred together across a week of grinding practice, long drives to obscure ranges, hours spent lying prone in damp fields, notebook open beside her, crosshairs fixed on targets that barely revealed themselves through wind and haze. Her hands had developed calluses in places she hadn't felt pain in years. The fatigue didn't bother her. It was a quiet kind of pain, the kind that came with purpose, the kind that felt earned. Inside her apartment, she moved with silent precision, packing each item in her range bag methodically: ear protection, range glasses, gloves, a spare pair of boots, a hard case containing the Glock, and another for her borrowed rifles. Nathan's notebook went last, slipped into an inner pocket, close to her body. Not for luck, for guidance. She stopped for a moment, standing in the middle of the room, staring at the wall in front of her where nothing hung. No plaques, no photos, no trophies. This wasn't her world, not in the same way it was Blake's. She hadn't trained for the stage. She didn't crave attention. But tomorrow, like it or not, eyes would be on her. Michael called just after 10 p.m. "Everything ready?" he asked without preamble. "As ready as I can be," she said. "You won't be alone out there," he replied. "Some of the guys, former team, couple of veterans Nathan helped train, will be there. Quiet, back row, but we'll be watching." Emma let that settle over her like armor. "Thanks," she said quietly. "It means more than you know." "He'd be proud of you, Emma, and he'd be grinning knowing you're about to put a man like Radcliffe in his place. Just be careful. A guy like that doesn't plan to lose, and when people like him feel cornered, they don't play clean." "I know." They said goodnight, and Emma stood for a long moment in the quiet. The city hummed outside, distant and detached. She walked to her bedroom, picked up a framed photo from her nightstand. Nathan in uniform, smiling, standing beside her in their old backyard. She held it for a moment, then gently placed it face down. Not to forget, but because she didn't want to look back tomorrow, only forward. Across town, Blake wasn't sleeping either. He stood barefoot in his penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the glittering skyline, scotch in hand, suit jacket tossed over a leather chair. A team of advisors had just left: PR reps, legal counsel, a brand manager from his primary sponsor. The competition had ballooned into something much bigger than the club originally intended. Private stream access had been sold to donors and corporate clients. Media coverage would follow, and if he won, and he fully intended to, He'd restore the narrative. He'd shut down the buzz about Emma Miller, the mysterious day-pass shooter with 3 lucky shots and a sob story. But there was a weight behind his eyes now, something he couldn't shake. The more he'd learned about her, the less confident he'd felt. The reports were thorough: Nathan Miller's service record, deployment history, reputation. The man had been a ghost, and now Blake was facing the ghost's wife, trained by someone who had hit shots from half a mile away in combat zones most civilians couldn't point to on a map. He downed the last of his drink and stared at his reflection. He looked tired. He hated that. Jessica appeared in the doorway behind him, robe tied loosely, tablet still in her hand. "You should sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Blake didn't move. "Did you watch the video I sent you? The one of her training with the Macmillan?" Jessica hesitated. "I did." "Well, she's improved. A lot. She's steady." Blake turned around, expression unreadable. "She's not just steady, she's trained, she's disciplined. I saw it the moment she picked up that Glock. That wasn't luck. That was controlled violence, the kind you only learn from someone who's been to war." Jessica sat down on the couch and crossed her arms. "So what are you going to do if she beats you?" He didn't answer. "You could walk away," she offered. "Pay the charity, let her have the spotlight for one day. Everyone would still remember your records, your titles. You don't need this." Blake shook his head. "You don't understand. If I lose, it's not just the title, it's the myth. And if I lose to someone outside the system, a woman who walked in from nowhere and outshot me, it tells every sponsor, every board member, every investor that what I built can be undone in a single afternoon. I don't get to walk away from that." Jessica didn't argue. She just looked at him, quiet and a little sad. Blake walked over to the bar, poured another drink, then stopped halfway. He stared at the amber liquid, then poured it back into the bottle, leaving the glass empty. Without a word, he walked into the next room, leaving the lights on behind him. At 5:15 the next morning, Emma stood in her kitchen sipping black coffee, already dressed in jeans, a navy button-up, and her worn boots. Her gear was packed, her mind still. The competition wasn't until 9, but she wanted to be early. She wanted to stand in the space before the noise arrived, before Blake's entourage flooded the floor, before the crowd and the stares and the assumptions. She arrived at the Elite Shooters Club just before 6 a.m., greeted only by the early security team and Rebecca, who looked surprised but impressed. The 2 women stood at the edge of the main range, alone in the vast, echoing room that would soon become an arena. "I had a feeling you'd come early," Rebecca said. "Wanted to check everything myself. I don't trust Blake's people. He pushed hard for special setups, got most of what he asked for. But I've done a sweep, trigger tensions, sight calibrations, ammo consistency. Nothing's been tampered with. Not that I can prove, anyway." Emma nodded. "Thank you." Rebecca hesitated, then asked the question that had been circling her all week. "Why are you really doing this? You didn't seem like someone looking for the spotlight." "I'm not." "Then why?" Emma didn't speak right away. She looked out across the range, where the numbered stations stood in silent rows. "Because my husband taught me to never back down from a fight when someone tries to write you off, and because too many people in this world mistake silence for weakness." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Well, today I think silence is about to speak louder than ever." Emma adjusted the strap on her bag, walked toward the locker room to prepare, and behind her, Rebecca stood quietly, watching her go. The sun had just begun to rise over the trees, spilling light through the club's tall windows, and for the first time in a long time, the place didn't feel like a temple built for one man. It felt like a battlefield, and the battle was about to begin. By 8:30, the Elite Shooters Club was unrecognizable. What had once been a quiet, exclusive sanctuary reserved for Boston's wealthy and well-connected now hummed with the tension of a high-stakes showdown. The main competition range had been transformed into something more theatrical than technical. Large banners hung from the ceiling bearing the names of the 2 competitors, Radcliffe on one side in bold, sharp serif lettering beneath his Olympic accolades and national records, and opposite it simply Miller, with no list of credentials, no career highlights, just a name that had become legend in the span of 7 days. The crowd filtered in steadily, an invitation-only list of club members, defense contractors, corporate sponsors, and VIPs with enough wealth to demand seats to events that didn't even exist a week ago. There were whispers of a documentary crew arriving. Someone said one of Blake's sponsors had flown in from Zurich. A few old guard members grumbled about tradition and decorum, but they still took their seats in the front row, because even they, with all their disdain for spectacle, wanted to see if the rumors were true. Blake entered with his usual entourage, dressed in a tailored shooting jacket adorned with sponsor logos, mirrored glasses, and a confident gait that screamed control. His team parted the crowd like a tide. Men clapped him on the back, offered words of encouragement. Women smiled, cameras clicked. It was his world, his fortress, and every step he took reinforced the illusion that nothing could shake him. But Blake's eyes were scanning, not for fans or cameras, for her. When he finally spotted Emma near the far end of the range, she was alone, standing quietly, duffel bag at her side, tightening the strap of one glove. No jacket, no entourage. Her shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled just past the wrists. Her posture was calm but centered, as if she were holding something heavy and invisible inside her chest, something anchored. He crossed the distance in long, deliberate steps, the crowd parting again to watch the confrontation. He stopped just a few feet from her and gave a slow, performative smile. "Miss Miller," he said, voice low and poised, "I trust you slept well." There was a subtle pause, just long enough for those listening nearby to lean in. Emma looked up, her eyes locking with his. "I did," she replied, unfazed. "And you?" Blake's smile didn't falter, but it didn't deepen either. "I don't usually worry the night before a match, but I do tend to review my opponents. I like to know what I'm dealing with." "Then you know everything you need to," she said, "and nothing that matters." The jab was quiet, almost courteous, but it hit its mark. Blake's smile cooled a few degrees, and he shifted slightly in place, just enough to betray a crack in his veneer. "Well," he said, straightening his posture, "let's see if all that training pays off. One perfect day doesn't make a competitor. Consistency does. Pressure separates instinct from skill." Emma tilted her head slightly. "That why you tried to stack the rules in your favor?" A hush rolled through those close enough to hear. Blake's jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly. "I thought we were both professionals. You understand how these things work. The board approved everything." "I'm sure they did." Before the exchange could deepen, Rebecca Johnson appeared between them, clipboard in hand, expression neutral but sharp. "The range is ready. Both shooters will begin at Station 1 in 10 minutes. Targets will be standardized across all lanes. Equipment has been verified, logged, and sealed overnight. Ammo was weighed and recorded this morning by third-party range masters. Any objections must be raised now." Neither spoke. Rebecca looked at Emma. "You'll begin at Lane 6. Mr. Radcliffe will take Lane 1. Scores will be logged live and projected on the display boards behind each station." Emma gave a small nod. Blake turned to go, but stopped one last time. Last chance to withdraw. No shame in walking away. Emma didn't even blink. "Then why do you sound nervous?" She walked to her station without waiting for his reply. The crowd buzzed, hushed voices and shifting feet. A few people clapped politely. Some watched Blake, waiting for his confident swagger to return. Others stared at Emma, searching for any sign of weakness. But there was none. She laid her gear out neatly. No custom grips, no brand endorsements, just practical tools and disciplined movement. The range buzzer sounded. Station 1 began. 10 targets, close-range pistol, the kind of opening drill meant to warm up muscle memory. Blake's shots came fast and precise, 2 per second, his posture immaculate, his follow-through tight. All 10 targets hit. His score flashed, 100 points. Emma waited half a beat before raising her weapon. No rush, no need to match his tempo. She took her time between each shot, exhaling slowly before each pull. The rhythm wasn't flashy, but each shot struck clean. Her score, 100 points. A murmur ran through the audience. Station 2, a compact carbine, mid-range, a custom trigger, hair-sensitive, known for throwing off inexperienced shooters. Blake finished in less than 10 seconds, one target clipped at the edge, but still scored high, 98 points. Emma stepped up. The carbine wasn't one she had used recently. She adjusted slightly, recalibrated by feel, checked the sights with a subtle flick of her wrist. The first shot was perfect. So was the second. By the third, her body was already correcting the gun's feedback. 10 shots later, her score flashed 97. Blake pulled ahead by a point. Stations 3 through 5 moved quickly, different firearms, increasing complexity. A vintage revolver with a stiff trigger, a semi-auto with a non-standard magazine feed, a lightweight rifle with a subtle left drift from overuse. Blake adapted with practiced ease. He knew these weapons. He'd trained on them for years. Emma, meanwhile, adjusted shot by shot, learning as she went, her scores staying steady, never lower than 95. By the time they reached Station 6, Blake led by only 3 points, and the audience noticed. The buzz had changed. People whispered her name, not the woman or the newcomer. Emma. Some of Blake's own supporters began glancing toward her lane between shots, their eyes lingering a little longer each time she moved. Station 7 tested reload speed under pressure. Blake finished in record time, but one shot went wide from a rushed grip. Score, 94. Emma took longer, but all her shots hit. Score, 96. They were nearly tied. Station 8 introduced a variable wind element. External fans activated, forcing shooters to adjust for drift. Blake's confidence faltered for the first time. He misjudged the crosswind on 2 shots. Score, 91. Emma paused longer before starting, closing her eyes for a moment, then readjusting her stance, recalling Nathan's notes. "Wind doesn't lie," he used to say. "It sings, if you listen." She adjusted accordingly. Score, 95. Emma was now ahead, and Blake knew it. He stormed towards Station 9, moving faster than before, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. The targets were smaller now, more difficult, the lighting dimmer. Blake fired with visible frustration. His control was slipping. A flash of anger came after one poor grouping. Score, 88. Emma followed with a stillness that was unnerving. Her breathing hadn't changed. Her posture remained exact. She adjusted her shots incrementally, like someone solving an equation one variable at a time. Score, 93. The room shifted. A wave of energy passed through the crowd, slow, rolling awe. It was happening. The champion was trailing, and Emma Miller, the woman who had arrived a week ago with a borrowed gun and a folded day pass, was leading. All that remained was Station 10, the Macmillan TAC 338. The long-range monster Blake had insisted upon. It was meant to break her, but it might be the only thing left that could break him. The final station loomed at the far end of the range like a silent judge, its presence heavier than any of the others. The Macmillan TAC 338 rested on its mount, gleaming under the overhead lights, its long barrel extending over the lane like the finger of a surgeon pointed at the heart of the distant target. The crowd had fallen into a reverent hush. This was the weapon Blake had chosen as his finale, his exclamation point, the one firearm on the list designed to separate him not just from Emma, but from every shooter in the country. It was exotic, temperamental, demanding. He had used it in exhibitions, in long-range matches, even in private bet sessions with elite military contacts. It was a gun with bite and history. He approached the bench with ceremony, pausing to roll his shoulders before laying a hand on the grip. His fingers moved with confidence born from countless hours behind the scope. The rangemaster gave the nod. Blake loaded the first round and settled into the prone position with practiced grace. He inhaled, held it, then began. The silence was so complete that the sound of each shot felt like a slow drum beat echoing through a church hall. 1, 2, 3, steady cadence. 4, 5. The sixth landed a little wide, but not enough to cost him heavily. 7, 8, 9, all clustered tight. Then the final shot. Blake hesitated slightly. He could feel the heat on the back of his neck, the eyes, the shift in momentum. It wasn't just about the target anymore. It was about proving the story he'd built over decades still held weight, that he was still the pinnacle. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out. 10 rounds, 9 hits clustered inside the inner ring. 1 just on the line, enough to score but not perfect. His final total, 96. Respectable. For anyone else, it would have been a victory, but the crowd knew the math, knew what was left on the table, knew what Emma needed to win. She walked slowly to the station, her steps even, deliberate. Her face was unreadable, no triumph, no fear, just a composure that felt impossible to those watching. She had no entourage, no whispered reassurances in her ear, no one adjusting her gear or patting her shoulder. She didn't seem to need it. She placed her duffel bag beside the bench and opened it, retrieving her ear protection, gloves, and a folded page from Nathan's notebook. She read it once, silently, and slid it back into her pocket. Then she lay down behind the Macmillan. It didn't fit her the way it fit Blake. It was too long, too customized, the scope slightly off-center from what she was used to. But she didn't complain. She adjusted, measured, aligned. Her breath slowed, long and shallow. She glanced at the wind flags downrange. Tiny flickers, just enough to whisper the conditions to those who knew how to listen. She waited. Then came the first shot. The sound cracked and the target jolted faintly in the distance. The rangemaster called out the hit, inner ring. A ripple moved through the audience. Second shot, closer. Third, tighter still. Her grouping was forming, one deliberate shot at a time. She wasn't shooting fast. She was shooting right. Each round sounded like punctuation. Each impact confirmed what those watching were only just starting to believe. Blake stood behind his station, arms folded, jaw tense. For the first time, he was truly silent, not calculating, not posing, just watching. By the 6th shot, Emma had matched his grouping. By the 7th, she had pulled ahead. Shot 8 hit center. Shot 9 was so precise, it passed clean through a hole made by the 3rd. The murmurs had faded completely now. It was as if the crowd was afraid to breathe too loudly and break the rhythm she had found. Then came the 10th shot. She paused longer than before, adjusted her shoulder just slightly, rolled the tension from her neck. Her hand shifted to her wedding ring, twisting it once gently, like a tether grounding her to something unseen. She inhaled, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot landed. Direct center. Perfect. The room didn't erupt. Not immediately. It exhaled. A wall of breath released all at once, followed by applause that began slowly, then swelled into something thunderous. A standing ovation rolled through the club like a rising tide. People who had dismissed her a week ago were now on their feet. Whispers turned to cheers, phones raised, cameras snapped. Somewhere someone called out her name, just once, but it echoed. Emma stood slowly, removed her gloves, and stepped back from the bench. Her face hadn't changed. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't looking for affirmation. She walked back to her gear and began packing it up with the same care and precision she'd shown from the beginning. To her, it wasn't over until every round was accounted for, every piece secured. Rebecca approached from the side, flanked by 2 officials carrying scorecards. She didn't need to say it. The numbers were already on the board. Emma, 96. Blake, 96, tied. But the final station had been weighted for 30% of the total score, a change Blake himself had insisted on. Emma had scored a perfect 100 at the most difficult stage. Blake, a 96. It was enough. The final total flashed across the board. Emma Miller, 95.8. Blake Radcliffe, 94.9. She had won. And she had done it with the odds stacked, the room loaded, the game tailored to someone else's advantage. Blake stared at the numbers, unmoving. He didn't speak. His arms dropped to his sides, fists clenched. The crowd's cheers didn't seem to register. He was watching his myth fracture in real time, and the person who broke it hadn't even raised her voice to do it. Rebecca moved to center stage, voice steady over the microphone. Final scores confirmed. Congratulations to Emma Miller, first place in today's challenge. She turned toward Emma. Would you like to say anything? Emma shook her head, then paused, looked up. I didn't come here to win anything, she said. I came to keep a promise. Then she stepped down from the platform and disappeared into the crowd. Blake remained where he was, still staring at the screen. He had designed the stage to showcase his dominance. Instead, it had become his reckoning. The silence that followed Emma's quiet exit stretched longer than anyone expected. No encore, no victory speech, no dramatic exit with the spotlight trailing behind her. She disappeared down the side hallway, duffel slung over her shoulder, leaving the crowd suspended in something between admiration and discomfort. They had come expecting fireworks, humiliation, maybe even a breakdown. At the very least, some satisfying reversal where the underdog wins and celebrates accordingly. But what they got instead was a reminder that not all victories are loud. Some are quiet, steady, and undeniable. And those are the ones that make people uncomfortable because they strip away spectacle and leave only the truth. Blake remained near his station, motionless. A few members of his entourage moved toward him but stopped short when they saw the look in his eyes. His expression was unreadable. Not rage, not shame, but something deeper and colder. He stared at the final score on the screen, the numbers glaring back at him in sterile clarity. The champion who never lost, defeated by a woman with no official record, no sponsor, no prior reputation. And the worst part, the part that clawed at him most, was that there was no one else to blame. The equipment had been checked, the scoring was transparent. The event had been filmed, witnessed, and verified. She had simply beaten him. Rebecca Johnson approached him cautiously, her clipboard tucked under her arm. The board will need a final statement from you for the press, she said, and your sponsor's representative asked for a comment within the hour. Blake didn't turn to look at her, his jaw clenched. What am I supposed to say? That I got outshot by someone who doesn't even compete? Rebecca's voice remained neutral. You got outshot by someone who trained harder in 1 week than most people do in a year. Someone who didn't flinch when everything was stacked against her. Maybe that's worth saying. He turned to her now, his voice low and sharp. You think this is about one loss? I think it's about how you handle it, she replied. Before he could respond, a staff member approached with a tablet in hand. Mr. Radcliffe, there's something you need to see. Blake took the tablet with a sigh, expecting a sponsor memo or PR draft, but what he saw instead made his stomach twist. Security footage. The screen played a loop of his own technician entering the equipment room the night before the competition. The man moved quickly, checking weapons, making adjustments. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic. Just small, careful alterations, enough to give Blake's preferred configurations the edge he was accustomed to. Nothing illegal, technically, nothing that would violate club rules under casual inspection, but enough to spark questions if anyone chose to dig. What is this? Blake asked, but his voice faltered. Rebecca spoke again, softer this time. I reviewed the footage myself. It's being archived now. It's true he didn't tamper with Emma's station, but he altered settings on others, marginal changes, things that would only help someone who knew about them ahead of time. Blake's hand lowered the tablet slowly. The board hasn't made a decision yet, she continued, but sponsors are already asking questions, and the foundation has requested a formal response. If you want to walk away with anything intact, you need to get ahead of this. Blake didn't answer. He just stood there as the weight of it sank in. His legacy, his brand, his image, everything carefully constructed over years, now crumbling under a single loss and a few seconds of surveillance footage. He walked off the range floor without another word. Emma, by then, was already halfway home. She had driven in silence, windows down, letting the wind rush past her like a cleansing ritual. There was no music, no news, just the hum of the road and the distant echo of her own thoughts. She hadn't expected the wind to feel like this. Not hollow, not empty, but not triumphant either. It felt like completion, like the final page of a story she hadn't realized she'd been writing since the day she watched Nathan's coffin lowered into the ground. She pulled into her apartment complex and parked, sitting in the car for a moment longer than she needed to. She stared at her hands, still steady, still strong, and felt the slow rising tide of exhaustion begin to creep in, not just from the physical toll, but from the emotional weight she'd carried every day of the past week, the memories, the pressure, the expectations, spoken and unspoken. She closed her eyes. In the quiet, she could still hear Nathan's voice, not in words, but in presence, in the silence between heartbeats, in the stillness she had only learned to find because of him. Her phone buzzed. A message from Michael. "You were incredible." We all watched. Nathan would have been in the front row grinning like an idiot. Another message followed seconds later. "By the way, it's already gone viral. Video clips are everywhere. Everyone's asking who Emma Miller is." She smiled, just a little, then typed her reply. "She's no one special, just someone who kept her promise." Emma walked into her apartment, dropped her bag on the floor, and headed straight to the small wooden box she kept tucked beneath the bed. She opened it slowly and placed the notebook inside, alongside the folded photo and Nathan's flag. She didn't close the lid yet. Instead, she sat cross-legged beside it, the ache in her shoulders finally registering now that adrenaline had faded. She reached for the photo again and stared at their faces, her younger, carefree smile, his arm around her, his eyes always just a little distant, like he was watching something only he could see. "I did it," she whispered. She sat there a long while, and when she finally rose to her feet and closed the box, it was with the quiet understanding that something had ended. Not just the challenge, not just the story of the widow in hiding, but the weight she had carried alone for too long. She had honored Nathan, she had honored herself, and without even trying, she had changed everything. By the following morning, Emma's name had traveled far beyond the walls of the elite shooters club. What had started as a whispered curiosity among members and competitors had become something louder, broader, and harder to ignore. Footage of her final 10 shots with the TAC-338 had gone viral overnight. Uploaded by someone in the crowd, it showed only her silhouette behind the scope, the rhythmic cracks of each round, and the eventual eruption of applause. But the video's caption carried more weight than the visuals. The quietest victory in club history. Emma Miller outshoots the champion. News outlets began picking it up, first local, then national. Sports blogs, veteran forums, women's interest pages, shooting publications. They all told the same story, each from a different angle. Some called it a Cinderella moment, others a symbolic toppling of elitism. But the narrative that spread fastest wasn't about competition or skill, it was about resilience. About a widow trained by her late husband, honoring his legacy not through tears or tributes, but through absolute precision. By noon, Emma had received over 50 requests, interviews, sponsorship offers, podcast invitations, social media inquiries from people offering brand deals and platform exposure. Her inbox had filled with messages from strangers sharing their own stories of grief and perseverance. Veterans who had trained with Nathan wrote in, recalling old range days and quiet nods of respect he'd earned in places few civilians would ever know. And amid all of it, Michael texted again, simply, he would have hated the attention, but he'd have watched every second. Emma hadn't responded yet. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to being a symbol. She didn't want to be anyone's example. She had only meant to keep a promise, to show up, shoot straight, and leave with her integrity intact. She never wanted this to become a movement or a moment. And yet, that's exactly what it was becoming. Across town, Blake sat in a closed-door meeting with his crisis team. The air was stiff with tension. His attorney paced the perimeter, rattling off options, statements they could release, angles they could pivot toward, phrases that might soften the fallout. His PR advisor suggested a controlled interview, one where Blake could acknowledge his loss with humility and shift attention to his philanthropic work. But Blake didn't speak. He sat in the corner of the room, hands clasped tightly between his knees, watching a muted TV screen loop the same footage everyone else was watching. Emma's last 3 shots. The headlines called her things he never imagined he'd see, associated with anyone but himself. The natural, the ghost's legacy, the woman who shot with purpose. He turned away from the screen, jaw clenched. "What if I challenged her again?" he asked suddenly. His team stared at him in silence. "Not now," he continued. "Later. A rematch. Different format. Something bigger." His attorney spoke first. "You do that now, you'll look petty, desperate. You'll validate every accusation coming your way. Let it go." "I can't just disappear," Blake said, louder now. "I built this name. I built this world. I've carried it for years." The PR rep stepped forward. "Then carry it with dignity. Make a statement. Own the loss. Show people you're human." Blake said nothing. His fingers tightened into fists. He wasn't used to losing, and he definitely wasn't used to being told how to lose. That night, while networks replayed clips and publications drafted features titled "The Woman Who Beat the System," Emma sat in her living room, curled on the couch, a mug of tea cooling on the table beside her. She hadn't left her apartment all day. Every time she considered it, her phone buzzed again with another ping, another alert, another stranger reaching out with well-meaning curiosity or breathless awe. She appreciated the kindness behind it, but she felt the pull of retreat stronger with each message. Eventually, she called Michael. "I need air," she said, her voice low. "I need to go somewhere that doesn't care what happened this week." Michael didn't ask questions. He just told her to pack a jacket. They drove north, past the edge of the city, into open roads flanked by tall pines and rocky coastline. An hour later, they parked beside a lake that shimmered under the moonlight, the water glassy and untouched. Michael handed her a flashlight but didn't speak as they walked down to the edge. They stood there in silence, watching the wind skim across the surface. "You did what you came to do," he said finally, "but it doesn't mean you owe them anything else." Emma nodded. "They want to turn it into something, a cause, a campaign. I'm not that person." "You don't have to be," Michael said. "You showed them what strength looks like when no one's clapping for you. That's enough." She stared out over the water. "Do you think Nathan would have liked seeing all of this?" Michael gave a small smile. "Number, but he would have been damn proud. Not because you won, because you never gave in to the noise." Emma stayed quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think I'm ready to move forward." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know I don't want to hide anymore." In the days that followed, Emma turned down most interview requests. She declined the big-name sponsorships, the showy platforms, the televised competitions. But one invitation caught her attention, a quiet one, sent via email from a small non-profit in New Hampshire, a veteran-led organization developing a marksmanship program for wounded soldiers and transitioning service members. They didn't offer money or publicity. They offered something else. "We heard about what you did. We're building something that matters. We'd be honored if you'd help." Emma didn't respond right away, but she bookmarked the message, and as the headlines moved on and the world chased its next story, she returned to the range, not for glory or validation, but for something simpler, the feel of the grip in her hand, the sound of the breath before the shot, the clarity that came only when everything else fell away, not as a widow, not as a symbol, but as Emma, still here, still standing. It had been 10 days since the match, and Emma still hadn't stepped back into the Elite Shooters Club, not because she was avoiding it, but because the space she had once entered as a complete unknown no longer offered her the quiet anonymity she valued. Her name was etched into the conversation now. She was no longer the woman with the day pass and department store jeans. She was Miller, the challenger who walked into the lion's den and left with its crown without raising her voice. And while the emails, messages, and news cycles had begun to taper, the echoes of what she had done remained. It wasn't just that she'd beaten Blake Radcliffe, it was how she'd done it, with discipline, with composure, with something deeper than talent, a kind of anchored purpose that people didn't see often, and when they did, they remembered it. She spent her mornings differently now. The first few days after the match were filled with fatigue, and she let herself rest without guilt. But soon, rest became habit, and habit gave way to rhythm. She was up before sunrise, stretching on the back balcony with the wind curling around her sleeves. She cooked again, real meals, not just coffee and toast. She organized her closet, her kitchen, her mind. Each small action was a reassertion of self. Not the self who had disappeared into spreadsheets and sorrow after Nathan's death, but the woman who had stood under a grey sky at Arlington and made herself a vow to carry what he'd given her forward. By the middle of the second week, the call came. It was Rebecca Johnson. Emma recognized the number, but still hesitated before answering. When she finally picked up, Rebecca's voice was direct as ever, but tinged with something warmer this time. "I wanted you to hear it from me before it hits the newsletter," she said. "The board reviewed the footage, the results, and the complaints. Blake Radcliffe's championship standing has been formally suspended pending internal review. He won't be competing under the club's banner for at least a year." Emma listened quietly. "And you?" Rebecca continued. "You've been nominated for honorary member status. You wouldn't have to pay dues, full access, voting rights, invitations to advanced competitions." Emma looked out the window at the quiet street below. The offer was well-meaning, a sign of respect, a nod to what she'd done, but she didn't respond immediately. Rebecca sensed the hesitation. "You don't have to decide now, just know that a lot of people here saw something in you that doesn't come around often. Not just skill, but the kind of integrity that's been missing. Some of the younger members, especially the women, they're showing up more, signing up for training, asking questions." Emma smiled faintly. "I'm glad," she said, "but I didn't shoot for the club. I shot for something else." "I know," Rebecca said. "That's why it mattered." They spoke a few minutes longer before hanging up. Emma sat in the stillness that followed, fingers curled around a cup of tea, the warmth soothing but not enough to ground the thoughts swirling in her chest. She thought again of the email from the non-profit group in New Hampshire, the one asking if she'd be willing to help with a marksmanship program for veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with applause or camera crews. But it offered something she hadn't realized she was looking for until that moment: continuity. The next day she made the drive up. The facility was modest, an old warehouse repurposed into a training center flanked by woods and gravel lots. Inside, a handful of veterans moved quietly through drills, their movements stiff but purposeful. Some had visible injuries, braces, canes, missing limbs. Others carried their wounds inward, evident in their eyes, their hesitation, the way they checked the exits instinctively. The program director, Colonel James Harrison, was a tall man with a voice like worn leather and a handshake that said he'd seen too much to be impressed by anything. But when Emma introduced herself, he didn't offer praise or small talk. He simply said, "We're glad you're here. We've got a lot of good people who've lost their center. They need structure, purpose, someone who understands what control really means. You interested?" She nodded. More than interested. He led her through the building, showing her the training rooms, the shooting lanes, the therapy center tucked in the back corner. "We don't just put guns in their hands," he said. "We give them a process, something to build discipline around, breathing, stance, focus, all the things you don't unlearn. A lot of them miss the quiet more than they miss the chaos." Emma understood. Nathan had said something similar once, not long after they were married. The noise gets old, Em. It's the silence you learn to crave, the stillness that tells you you're in control. It was one of the only things he'd ever said about his work that didn't sound guarded. She began volunteering twice a week, then 3. By the end of the month, she was there almost daily, helping design drills, reviewing shooting techniques, and guiding the veterans through the same fundamentals Nathan had taught her. She watched them change, not quickly, not all at once, but slowly, one shot at a time. Eyes steadied, hands grew surer, breaths deepened. Emma didn't talk much, she didn't lecture. She simply demonstrated, corrected when needed, and showed them what control looked like in motion. And in the quiet, they listened. Word continued to spread about her work, not loudly, not on the front page, but among the people who mattered, men and women who had felt forgotten, fighters who carried memories they couldn't voice. For them, Emma wasn't a symbol or a champion. She was something far more powerful, proof that even in the aftermath of unspeakable loss, purpose could still be found. And sometimes it came down the barrel of a rifle, not as violence, but as precision, as a promise kept. One quiet morning as fall deepened across New England, Emma arrived early to the training center. The sun had barely crested the trees, casting long gold beams through the pine branches, bathing the parking lot in a soft glow that reminded her of the first hikes she and Nathan used to take in the Vermont woods before everything became deployment cycles and uncertain goodbyes. She parked in her usual spot, stepped out with her thermos in hand, and stood for a moment just to breathe. The crisp air bit at her cheeks, but it felt good, awake. She watched a small group of veterans filter into the building's front doors, some limping slightly, others moving slowly but with determination. The center was becoming a ritual for them, just as it had become one for her. Familiar. Repetitive, in the best way. Safe. Inside, she greeted the front desk staff with a nod and headed straight to the range where she'd spent countless hours over the past month. It was still empty, the lights just beginning to warm the concrete walls and the lined firing lanes. On the bench at the far end, a new shipment of gear sat unopened. Targets, ear protection, gloves. She set her thermos down and pulled on her range jacket, the movement automatic now, practiced. As she organized the supplies, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Colonel Harrison approaching with his usual slow gait and folded arms. "Got a surprise for you," he said with a rare twinkle in his eye. "Someone came by last night when you'd already gone, left something in the office with your name on it." Emma raised an eyebrow. That usually means trouble. Not this time. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. It was light, carefully wrapped, no return address. She peeled it open slowly, heart already tapping a little harder in her chest. Inside was a black leather-bound notebook. Nathan's. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened it and saw his handwriting. More entries, more calculations, more thoughts. But these weren't about her training. These were personal. Observations about long-range technique. Notes from his final months overseas. Drawings of modified scopes and bullet drop predictions written in his shorthand. At the back was a page folded into the spine. When she opened it, it wasn't a schematic or field note. It was a letter, written to her. Emma, if this ever makes its way to you, it means someone close to me kept their promise. Probably Reeves. He always swore he'd watch out for you. I hope he did. If you're holding this, I know you're probably still hurting, and I hate that I'm not there to walk through it with you. But if you're holding this, I also know you're still fighting. You don't have to wear a uniform to be a warrior. You don't need a badge or a title. You've already proven more strength than most of the men I served with. I told you once that you had the steadiest hands I'd ever seen, and I meant that. But what I didn't say enough was that your heart's just as steady. I'm not asking you to be brave. You already are. I'm just asking you not to disappear. Whatever the world tries to make you believe, hold on to this. Stillness is power. Kindness is not weakness, and your story isn't over. Keep going, Nate. She stared at the words for a long time, The ink slightly faded, the curve of his handwriting so familiar it made her ache. Her fingers trembled, but only briefly. Then they closed the notebook slowly, pressing it to her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply stood in the middle of the range, surrounded by the echoes of targets and steel, and felt something deep inside her finally settle. Not closure, but clarity. Colonel Harrison stepped away without a word. He knew what moments like that felt like, and some things needed no commentary. Later that day, after a session with 2 veterans working through trigger control drills, Emma gathered the instructors and volunteers in the conference room, the same room where plans were drawn, class rosters updated, and new recruits evaluated. She stood near the whiteboard, her notebook on the table beside her, and waited for the room to quiet. "I want to propose something," she began, voice calm but certain. "We've got the structure, we've got the curriculum, we're getting better equipment, and more people are coming through the door every week, but I think we're missing something." They listened intently. "We're doing a great job giving these men and women skills. We're helping them get control back. But a lot of them, especially the ones who don't talk much, aren't just here for targets and range time. They're here because they feel lost in silence, not the kind we teach, the kind that creeps in when you stop being part of a team, when you're not sure what your story even is anymore." She let the silence linger before continuing. "I want to start a peer instruction program, not just trainers teaching skills, veterans teaching each other, rotating leadership, story integration. One shooter talks through what brought them here, what the rifle helped them through. The story stays in the room, no judgment, just a chance to remind each other that they still matter." Someone asked what it would be called. She didn't hesitate. "Ghost Line." It was quiet for a moment. Then Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "I think Nathan would have liked that." The room agreed, and within a week, Ghost Line launched. Small at first, just a side group, off hours, but quickly it grew. Word spread through the veteran community. Shooters who had been skeptical at first stayed longer. They shared stories they hadn't spoken aloud in years. They practiced in pairs. They coached each other. They found stillness not just in breath and precision, but in being heard. Emma led the first few sessions, but made sure others stepped forward. She didn't want it to become hers alone. It needed to be theirs. One night, as she locked up after the last drill, Michael waited for her outside with 2 coffees. He handed one over with a smirk. "So, you're basically building a legacy now." Emma took a sip, smiling. "Not mine." He leaned against the railing, watching her. "Maybe, but I think you know it's becoming one anyway." She didn't argue, because for the first time since Nathan had died, she wasn't just surviving his absence. She was building something in his name, and in her own, something that wouldn't end when the range went quiet or the headlines faded. She was passing on the one thing he'd asked her to hold on to, stillness. And in doing so, she had become more than the woman who once fired 3 impossible shots. She had become the kind of person others aimed to become, precise, purposeful, unshakable. 2 months after the match, Emma stood in front of the newly mounted plaque at the entrance of the Ghost Line training wing. It was simple, elegant, fixed into the wall just beside the reinforced glass doors that led to the redesigned range. The letters had been etched deep into the metal, the inscription brief but deliberate. In honor of Master Chief Nathan R. Miller, the Ghost, whose silence taught us how to listen and whose discipline taught us how to breathe. Beneath it was a single phrase: "Stillness is power." The dedication ceremony had been modest, just the way Emma wanted. No press, no cameras, only the instructors, a handful of veterans, and a few of Nathan's old teammates who had come in from out of state. They didn't speak much, just offered nods and brief hugs and a few quiet toasts with paper cups filled with black coffee. It wasn't grief that filled the space, it was gravity. The kind of shared understanding that didn't need words. They'd all lost something. They were all building something in return. Emma had been asked to speak. She declined, But after the ceremony, as the others began filing out toward the mess hall for food, one of the newer students, a young former army medic named Riley, approached her. She was barely 25, thin and quiet, and still carried herself like she was waiting for someone to tell her what to do. But she'd shown promise, quick to learn, quick to adjust, not just with weapons, but with herself. Emma had seen it, the subtle shifts in her breathing, the steadier way she walked after each session. Riley hesitated before speaking. "I wanted to thank you." Emma looked up. "For what?" "For this place," she said, "for not trying to fix us, just for showing us we're still capable." Emma gave a soft smile. "You didn't need me to show you. You just needed a place to remember." Riley nodded, eyes glassy, then added, "I hope someday I can teach like you." "You will," Emma said. "The way you're learning, the way you're listening, you're already halfway there." That was the thing Emma had come to understand in the months since she'd picked up Nathan's Glock again. She wasn't here to be the best. She wasn't here to hold on to a title. Her job was to pass something down, to carry the memory of her husband not as a weight, but as a standard. Not everyone who came through Ghostline had seen combat. Not everyone bore visible scars. Some carried their pain in quiet habits and unspoken rituals. But the discipline of marksmanship gave them a map, a process, a stillness that didn't ask questions but made room for answers to rise on their own. The range was full most days now. What had started as an experiment had become a rhythm, woven into the lives of those who returned week after week. Some had begun bringing others, friends from old units, younger siblings, even spouses. And Emma found herself no longer just a trainer, but a connector, a guide. One afternoon, while reviewing new applicant files, she received a knock on the door of her small office. She looked up to see Colonel Harrison leaning in, a folded letter in his hand. "This came for you," he said. "Mailed to the Foundation's main office. No return address, but it's postmarked Boston." She took it, frowning slightly. The envelope was heavy stock, sealed with wax. Unusual. She waited until Harrison had stepped out before opening it. Inside was a typed letter. No name. But she recognized the language immediately. "Mrs. Miller Dash, you won. Cleanly, decisively. You earned every bit of it. I didn't handle the aftermath well. I lost more than a match that day. I lost something I didn't realize had already been slipping away, a sense of control I once mistook for respect. I've withdrawn from competition, temporarily, maybe permanently. I don't know yet, but I've started attending therapy. For the first time in my life, I'm listening instead of broadcasting. Your performance did something I didn't expect. It made me reflect, not retaliate. You don't owe me anything, but I wanted you to know. Your stillness unsettled me, and then it changed me. I'm not ready to thank you for that, but I'm learning to understand it." Emma stared at the signatureless letter for a long time. There was no need to speculate who it was from. The tone was unmistakable, the shift in voice, the absence of bravado. Blake Radcliffe. The man who had once humiliated her in front of a room full of strangers, now confessing, in his own guarded way, that he'd seen something in her that he couldn't ignore. She didn't show the letter to anyone. She didn't need to. That evening, she returned to the range, pulled out one of the center's lesser-used rifles, and began running her own drills. Not to prove anything, just to feel it again. The breath, the pause, the control. Each shot an echo, each target a moment in time she could still shape. Somewhere in that rhythm, she remembered something Nathan once told her, half asleep with his hand draped across her stomach in the early hours of a quiet Sunday. The world gets loud, too loud, but if you can keep your center, if you can return to the breath, to the trigger, to the stillness, that's where you stay real. She had thought it was just about shooting back then. Now she knew better. It was about everything, about how you carry your grief, how you stand up when you're underestimated, how you fight without fury, how you lead without needing the title, how you honor what was lost by building what's needed. And somewhere in the room, between the shots and the silence, she felt something shift again, Not the end of a journey, but the start of something she hadn't imagined when she first walked into that club with a day pass and a promise. Not just a name whispered in the halls of a once exclusive range, but a legacy growing quietly behind every shot taken in focus, in balance, and in belief. Winter crept in without warning, settling over the hills surrounding the training facility like a thick wool blanket. Snow coated the gravel paths, turned the range's outer berms into pale mounds, and muffled the sounds that used to echo sharply across the open space. But despite the cold, the center remained active. Heaters lined the walls. Instructors wore layers beneath their jackets. Veterans still came, some limping through the ice, others carrying their gear under thick coats, drawn not just by habit now, but by purpose. Ghostline had grown into more than a program. It had become a haven, equal parts training ground, support circle, and reminder that the quiet fight to heal was just as noble as any that took place in uniform. Emma adjusted to the season the way she adjusted to everything else, with patience. Her schedule didn't slow, but it changed shape. Mornings began earlier, prepping stations before the sun broke over the trees. Students took turns shoveling the walkways and brushing off the bench rests before each session. They grumbled about the cold, but never missed a day. Something about the discipline in the chill, the breath clouds rising with each exhale, made the practice feel even more deliberate. One afternoon, after a session with 3 new participants, 2 Marines and a Navy corpsman who'd just joined the program, Emma returned to her office and found a small package on her desk. No name, just a note taped to the top. Found this in one of Nathan's old footlockers at my place. Thought you should have it. M. She opened the box carefully. Inside was an old worn canvas cap, navy blue, faded almost to gray, with a small patch stitched onto the front, a ghost emblem. The stitching was tight, military grade. Below it, in thread barely visible from where, the words sight, stillness, precision. She held it in her hands, the fabric soft and fraying at the corners. The brim was bent perfectly, the way Nathan had always curved his hats with the slow roll of his forearm, never rushed, always meticulous. At the bottom of the box was a folded paper, a shooting log dated 3 months before Nathan's final deployment. It listed a sequence of shots taken during a long-range session, distances, weather conditions, wind speed, but in the margin, scribbled as if added after the fact, were 4 names. She recognized 3, teammates of Nathan's from stories he'd told. The 4th was her own. No rank, just Emma. 50 yards, 9/10, better under pressure than expected. Note, teach her the tack if we get enough time. She blinked slowly, tracing her name with her finger. There had never been enough time, but somehow she had learned it anyway. The next day, she wore the hat to the range. No announcement, no explanation. Just slid it onto her head like it had always been hers. Michael noticed first. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and looked away, a small smile tugging at his mouth. The others saw it too, and gradually, quietly, it became known. That cap meant something. Not authority, not rank. Legacy. It became a symbol of the thing Emma carried into every lesson. Not Nathan's ghost, but his method, his calm, his code. Word came that a regional veteran support network wanted to feature Ghostline in their winter newsletter. The center's leadership asked Emma to draft something, a summary of the program, its mission, the values it reinforced. She stared at a blank screen for almost 20 minutes before typing anything. She hated writing about herself, but eventually her fingers began to move. We're not here to train marksmen. We're here to help people remember who they were before the noise got too loud. Every breath we control, every shot we center, is a quiet act of return. To self, to discipline, to peace. This isn't about accuracy. It's about ownership, of grief, of skill, of the strength we thought we lost, but was waiting beneath the silence. We don't teach war. We teach stillness. She sent it without reading it again. That night, she stayed at the range after hours, walking the cold lanes alone. Snow drifted through the overhead lights, and the world seemed to move slower, as if the sky itself had paused. She stopped at lane 4, the one where she first taught a double amputee how to shoot again, using only shoulder control and breathing techniques. The target paper still hung, pierced through the center by one final perfect shot. As she stood there, her phone buzzed with a call. Rebecca. Emma hesitated, then answered. "I hope I'm not bothering you," Rebecca said. "I just wanted to tell you, Blake formally withdrew his name from the club's elite registry. Permanently. No press release, no statement. Just a quiet exit. He's selling the rest of his shares, stepping back." Emma said nothing for a moment. Was that his choice? Yes. Board gave him the option to return with a probation period. He declined, said it was time to listen more and perform less. Emma didn't smile, but something inside her felt lighter. Rebecca continued, "Also, one of our members anonymously donated $50,000 to the Veteran Support Foundation, same amount as the original wager." Emma raised an eyebrow. "No name? Just an envelope with a typed note. Better late than never." Emma nodded slowly. "Then it's done." "Feels like it," Rebecca said. "You ever coming back to visit?" "Maybe, when I've got something to say." They hung up, and Emma stood beneath the lights, snow swirling around her, shoulders steady beneath Nathan's old cap. In the distance, beyond the trees, the world buzzed with headlines and noise, and the rush of people trying to outrun their silence. But here, in this narrow stretch of packed snow and hanging targets, everything was still. She exhaled, watching the breath curl out into the cold air, then dissipate. And in that one simple moment, she knew with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end. It was exactly where she was meant to be. Spring came slowly that year, the thaw arriving in quiet moments, icicles dripping from the eaves of the training center, the crunch of gravel replacing the snowpack beneath boots, and the muted greens beginning to bloom along the edge of the forest. Emma noticed the changes not because she was looking for them, but because they began to match something happening inside her. A loosening, a warmth, a quiet sense that she was no longer carrying everything alone. The program had grown. What started with a few skeptical veterans had become a structured curriculum supported by volunteers, therapists, and donors from across the country. Every week brought new faces, some wide-eyed and tentative, others stone-faced and tight-lipped, all of them carrying stories in their silence. But as Emma had learned, the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded with memory, shaped by survival. Her job wasn't to fill it. Her job was to help them navigate through it. She had stepped back from the day-to-day logistics, trusting others to lead in areas she had once controlled. Riley now ran the onboarding sessions. Michael had taken charge of instructor development. A Navy sniper named Trevino, who had joined just a month after the program launched, handled advanced long-range coaching. Emma, still trained, still showed up to teach breathing, sight alignment, and control under pressure. But she no longer needed to be at the center of it. That was never the goal. She had become the foundation beneath something larger. On a rainy Thursday morning, she received an invitation, formal, embossed, unexpected. It was from the Veteran Support Foundation Board, asking her to speak at their annual fundraiser. The event would be held at a restored Colonial Hall in downtown Boston, filled with corporate sponsors, politicians, and high-ranking military officials. Emma stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, unsure if the rising tension in her chest was dread or disbelief. She hadn't spoken publicly since the match, hadn't stood before a room full of people with microphones waiting and spotlights shining. But something about the request felt different this time. It wasn't about performance, it was about legacy. The night of the event arrived with a calm drizzle falling over the city. She wore a navy dress with clean lines, no jewelry except for her wedding ring and a small pin with the Ghost Line insignia. Michael accompanied her, driving the truck they'd taken on range trips 100 times before. As they pulled up to the venue, the streetlights cast long reflections in the wet pavement. Emma stepped out, heels clicking against the stone, and took a deep breath. Inside, the hall glowed with golden chandeliers and polished oak floors. Guests mingled, their voices low, the clinking of glasses and rustle of suits filling the air. The walls were lined with photographs of veterans participating in recovery programs, art therapy, rehabilitation, counseling, and near the center, displayed beneath a soft spotlight, was a single black and white image. It was Emma at the range, caught mid-shot behind the Tace 338, her expression calm, shoulders locked, sighted through the scope. Someone had added a caption, "Stillness is power." She hadn't known that photo existed, and for a brief moment she felt the old discomfort rise, of being seen, of being elevated. But it passed, because she knew now what that image meant. Not fame, not triumph, but testimony. When she was introduced, the applause was kind but restrained, the kind reserved for someone unfamiliar but respected. She stepped onto the small stage with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove anything, only share something real. The room stilled as she adjusted the mic. She looked out at the faces, some polite, some curious, some weary. Then she began. "I walked into a shooting range almost a year ago with a borrowed gun and no expectations. I wasn't looking for redemption or recognition or to settle a score. I was there because I'd made a promise, one I wasn't sure I was ready to keep." Her voice didn't waver. She didn't need notes. "My husband was a Navy SEAL, a sniper, a quiet man who never boasted, who never told me the full extent of what he carried, because he didn't want me to carry it too. But what he did give me, deliberately, lovingly, was discipline, stillness, a kind of strength I didn't understand until after he was gone." She paused, letting the silence settle. "I spent 3 years hiding from that strength, grieving in a way that made me invisible even to myself. But when I finally picked up a weapon again, I didn't just remember how to shoot. I remembered who I was. Not his widow, not a symbol. Just a woman with steady hands, trained by someone who believed I could handle more than I thought." A few people leaned forward, listening more closely now. "I didn't beat someone that day at the range. I beat the doubt that had been living in my bones. And what came after, that competition, the attention, the interviews, none of it changed the reason I kept showing up, because somewhere out there, someone else was struggling in silence. Someone else was trying to remember how to breathe. Ghostline isn't just a program, it's a reminder that your stillness isn't weakness, that your story doesn't end just because someone else stopped seeing your value." She looked down at her hands, then back up. "I'm not a soldier. I'm not a champion. I'm just someone who kept a promise and found, in doing so, that healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in moments, in focus, in purpose, in people willing to meet you where you are and shoot beside you until you're ready to aim again." She stepped back from the mic, nodded once, and left the stage. This time, the applause wasn't polite. It was real, sustained. She didn't wait for it to end. She returned to her seat, and when Michael gave her that small, proud smile, she finally let herself smile back. Later that night, she stood outside the hall alone, listening to the rain again, soft against the sidewalk. The city buzzed behind her. Somewhere deep inside, the last pieces of who she used to be finally settled into place. She wasn't waiting for life to return. She was already living it, on her own terms, on her own range. The quiet wasn't an absence anymore, it was her power.